Well, welcome everybody, and start by saying thank you for your patience. We had a little bit of scrambling last minute on scheduling. Rudy, or Dr. Crew, will be here momentarily, I am told, and he will help Ben to discuss a little bit about the committee charge as well as participating in the rest of the meeting. Can everybody in the back hear me okay? I don't know how much louder I can talk, but I'll do my best. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Seth to do roll call, please.
Matt Donegan.
Here.
Mary Spilby.
Here.
Julia Brim-Edwards.
Present.
Ron Saxton.
Okay, and Ron is not joining, is that right? Okay, thank you. So with that, hopefully everybody has a copy of the agenda, and again, welcome everyone. I'm going to, since this is a kickoff meeting, we're going to talk a little bit about expectations, and I'm going to turn things over immediately to Ben Cannon.
Great, thank you, Matt. The governor's and Rudy's request of this subcommittee in the as its sort of first and primary order of business is to provide the OEIB in advance of its December meeting with recommendations around the future of education-related boards and commissions and proposed changes that the OEIB would recommend related to the organization of the state boards and commissions. So our expectation is that at the December meeting of OEIB, the full board would take up the work of this subcommittee. Obviously, I think Rudy could speak much better than I to the kind of longer-term plan for this subcommittee, which has a longer and broader agenda than the one I described, but we're pretty focused on the deadlines associated with preparing legislation for 2013, and that December OEIB meeting will be an important opportunity to offer input into the development of the governor's legislative agenda for 2013 related to the organization of boards and commissions. That work has a P20 scope. Much of the focus, however, has been on higher education, and that's, I think, the starting point that we have planned for today. And I'd be happy to sort of walk through the background materials that are here before you proceed with the rest of your agenda. First, it's hard not to have one's eye drawn towards this very large and colorful piece of paper, which I should note is marked by draft, and there are undoubtedly corrections, or maybe some of this is undoubtedly a matter of interpretation, but this is an attempt to sketch out an organizational chart for the boards and their executive directors related to higher education only. We're working on a similar version for the rest of the system, but this is a higher education version, and one thing that this committee could do helpfully, and certainly those in the audience as well, is provide us with corrections, amendments to it. You have a large packet, also marked draft, that's titled Makeup and Responsibilities of Boards and Commissions. This, you'll see the contents on the second page, and I apologize, members, for not getting this material to you in advance. It is background, and we'll do our best to supply this to you in a timely way. This was not provided in a timely way. This packet is really drawn almost entirely from Oregon revised statutes and attempts to lay out in a very in a reasonably concise way the membership and authorities of existing education-related boards and commissions. And again, a work in progress. We attempted to do some to provide this in a somewhat concise manner, so that meant exercising a little bit of editorial judgment, and there may be points of clarification or improved accuracy there that folks in the audience or you suggest. You have a memo that Chair Donegan sent to, we've included the copy of the memo that he sent to Andrea Henderson, Executive Director of the Oregon Community College Association last week. A similar memo was sent to Paul Kelly, who chairs the Governance and Policy Subcommittee of the State Board of Higher Education, and George Pernsteiner, the chancellor of the university system, asking them to present their thoughts on some of the topics before this committee at today's meeting. So I wanted you to see that. Chancellor Pernsteiner passed this memo along also to the presidents and of the universities, and you have in your packet a response from Ed Ray at OSU. There's both email and then his name. I thought these might be attached to each other. They're meant to be, but his email, but more importantly, his thoughts, which are on a document titled Local Governance Draft Legislation. He's taken the opportunity both to submit some comment on the local governing board question, as well as the specific questions that Chair Donegan asked in the memo. There's a document, P20 Governance OEIB Principles, which is a reprint some principles that the full OEIB adopted very early in this year related to the organization of our state infrastructure, and thought that would be helpful. And then we have, looks like, some of the testimony that we'll hear about today from OUS. In addition, I think that we're likely to hear from Paul or the Chancellor about the OUS information that's before you today. So that's what you have. Again, the focus here on this, how to organize the state system of boards and commissions. There is obviously a related question about the organization of state agencies. Those are pretty, they're part and parcel. Your thinking about the boards and commissions will obviously have some impact on the way state agencies are designed as well, but our hope is that, and our expectation is that you're really focused on the board and commission question, less on what does that mean for state agencies, what are they called, who runs them, so on and so forth. But obviously bearing in mind that there's a relationship between the two.
Thanks, Ben. I have a couple follow-up questions myself. Starting with this, just to help us understand the context here, is this intended to be a kind of a straw person for us to comment on, or how should we be thinking about
So
this?
I should have been clear, this was an attempt to represent the world as it is. And it may, as I said, it may need some updating. It actually, I'll call them out. Legislative Fiscal Office, who we work with to some extent, took a stab at this on a whiteboard. I heard about that in a meeting and said, well, I'd love to see, because I've been working on this myself. And so this originated, and then I've done some amendments and updating to what staff for the legislature attempted to describe in terms of the organizational chart for higher ed here. And then, as I said, there's a separate one, pre-K through 12. But again, world as it is, not a straw man. That would be up to this committee, I think, to bring forward in a subsequent meeting.
Okay, so world as it is, and if this session failed to produce any further legislation, this is what we got.
Yes.
I see the principles that have been distributed, and obviously streamlining is a kind of a very commonly used term. Any just general guidance or input from the governor's office with regard to what streamlining means? Is this kind of no net gain? Is this a sense of, just reduce as much waste as you can, or what sounds like a?
Yeah, I think our starting point is not a number when it comes to boards and commissions. It's not even principally a, net reduction. I don't think that's the right way to approach this question. It really is about what functions should the state deliver, and then which boards are best equipped to deliver on those functions, and how should those boards be constituted in relation to each other. So I think that the key overarching principle for the governor is form should follow function. When at the same time, so set that's sort of one pillar of the work. I think the other is, and it's certainly expressed by this chart, that we have a problem with clarity. Set aside whether we have too many or not enough. We have a clarity issue, particularly around higher education, the university system, the existence of both the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and State Board of Higher Ed with somewhat overlapping jurisdiction. And that does not feel to us to be a tenuous place to be trying to do this work moving forward. Again, I don't think it's about a number as much as it is around clarity and around doing the work, the functions. So streamlining, yes, does appear in here. And I think streamlining is one way to express that idea of clarification.
We have invited testimony is going to be next on the agenda. Before I turn to that, I want to give Dr. Crew the opportunity to join the discussion as well. Welcome, Dr. Crew, and I'll turn it over to you here in just a moment. But before I do, Ben, can you just, do we have a list of folks that are going to testify today?
There's no one who's signed up to
Our
testify.
invitation was extended to Paul and George and Andrea, or anyone that Andrea wants to send up on her behalf. And then we're certainly taking other testimony as well. So any member of the public who's interested in testifying can sign up and be heard during the public testimony portion of this. But the invitees were those who received your memo last week.
Okay, and we have Dr. Ray has submitted written testimony, but there's nobody from OSU that's going to. Are there any other university representatives from any of the universities going to submit further testimony?
Before we get to the testimony, can we have a discussion about, and maybe I missed this at some point, but what our charge, our deliverables, kind of what our work plan looks like? I noticed we have a meeting scheduled for later this week, another one as well, but it would be good to know what the cadence, what we're expected to deliver before the legislative session, over what time plan, so that we have a sense of what we're working towards before we start getting testimony.
Yeah, no, that was the intent as well, Julie. I was just trying to make sure we've got all the submitted testimony that we're gonna hear. So I was actually going to turn it over to Rudy and Ben to address kind of the rest of the process questions.
I'll just reiterate what I said, and then Rudy may want to elaborate. But from the governor's perspective, we're in the sort of beginning of the crunch of preparation of governor's legislation to the 2013 session. And on this topic, his hope is that the OEIB at its December meeting will have provide input either via a general discussion or potentially a formal motion, not probably on specific bill language. I don't think it's realistic to think that we'll have specific statutory language, but a framework for how the state's P20 infrastructure, for what changes the governor should propose to make to the state's P20 infrastructure in the 13th session. That may be, you may choose to describe a kind of phased plan where a portion, a partial step is made in the first year and another in the second or third, and so on and so forth. But that's his expectation in the kind of short term, and then there is, I think, a longer term agenda for this committee as well.
Yeah, I'd like, just in an effort to kind of just get on with any testimony that's here, I don't really have a lot to add to this, but I do think it's going to be important for us to think through, and the purpose of this group really is both in the short and long term to actually ask and answer a lot of the questions around both what Ben was talking about before in terms of form and function, But I think critically to this, it's a matter of also integrating this with some of the other work that's going on around things like compacts and a whole host of other sort of policy issues that are on the table that may not necessarily immediately be on this docket, but are certainly tangential to it. So I think to the extent that we can keep these things sort of all in the orbit and allow for the conversation to sort of migrate a little bit, such that it at least touches base with some of the other realities of the day, that would be very helpful.
Ben, you mentioned subsequent, work plans or for this committee. What should we think about there in terms of focusing on this session versus down the road?
Well, I think when you look at the kind of parcel of work that I'm describing or defining related to the organization of the state's infrastructure, this committee may acknowledge that and even set a direction for or set an endpoint for that work, but only describe a certain amount of it occurring in 2013. I just think that's a plausible way to approach it. So that's what I had in mind. I think at the same time, there are issues that aren't about the organization of the state infrastructure. And this subcommittee has pretty broad purview, achievement compacts. I think there's a nexus there, and other policies that this committee may be tasked with bringing forward to the full OEIB.
So in terms of, at the December meeting, if we're going to have a framework, is that primarily, so it looks like today's focus on higher ed, is it going to be a pre-K through 20, or is there a suggestion that this is going to be a part of it, just a portion of the system? Or, and then I guess the second piece, so that's the organizational. Then are there other items that the governor has on his policy agenda that would naturally fit in within the portfolio of this subcommittee that we need to get on our radar screen as well?
So the answer to your second question is no. There are not other items. The governor's education agenda will be a budget, a P20 budget, and will be this work related to the organization of the state's infrastructure and the relationship of the state with local boards and education entities. The organization of the state's infrastructure is a P20 question. Today's background materials and testimony is focused on higher ed. I think we're starting there because that's where there's the most need for work. But some of the broader questions and I think the legislation may have a broader dimension.
So, I'm trying to think about how to formulate this question, Ben and Rudy, but obviously one of the variables that we don't yet know about is the outcome of the institutional boards, and so that could affect how we view the overall architecture. What kind of assumptions should we make, or how would you like us to handle that, given the uncertainty around how that's going to play out?
I'll take a stab at it, and others may have other thoughts, but the governor has expressed his support with the concept of universities that seek it obtaining institutional boards consistent with high levels of accountability to the state. And at the same time, I think that much of this work about the organization of the state's infrastructure is possible. I think you can get to some clarity on that without having resolved that question of which universities, if any, will achieve their own institutional boards in this session. One of the kind of premises for, or kind of principles for this work, P20, is that local education entities, whether they're universities, community colleges, K-12 districts, early learning entities, regardless of how they're governed, the precise arrangements for their governance, that those local institutions should have generally greater levels of flexibility and autonomy to respond to local needs, to innovate, and to meet the needs of students in those communities. And we're attempting to, we're asking you to help with the development of a state infrastructure that reinforces that, and reinforces that in ways that at the same time as they potentially develop more authority and a flexibility to local entities, use the state's role as an investor, a coordinator, a convener, an establisher of outcomes, use those things to ensure levels of accountability to the state for outcomes as well. So that's sort of the stew that we're swimming in, and I think it characterizes the work of the OEIB, certainly the governor's thoughts to date.
Mary, any questions about the process?
Well, I'm just wondering, I really appreciate that OCCA was invited with testimony, but just for symmetry, State Board of Higher Ed and George were asked to answer these questions. State Board of Education and our commissioner might have something to say in terms of the governance as well. I mean, OCCA represents all 17 community colleges, but the State Board of Ed piece is kind of missing here.
Yeah, so part of that was the result of I think we were attempting to sort of divide up the work between the meetings, and certainly, particularly when we move into that K-12 space,
Right.
that is the intent to ask for input as well. Community colleges, of course, are in that kind of straddle both
Right.
words via the state Board of Ed, but we'll certainly get that input, and Cam is very welcome to participate today or at any point.
Thank you.
So I'm curious also whether, it sounds like the governor doesn't have a freestanding policy agenda other than the budget, or it may come out of this, but are there bills that are being generated by legislative leadership or the interim education committees that impact this work that we might want to develop a point of view on or engage so that we have a coordinated policy-making structure that we can be providing sort of our thoughts on work that may be happening in other forums?
It's a great question, and I don't have a definite answer to it. I have not heard about specific legislative concepts coming forward from legislators, but I would not be surprised at all if in a month after the election we do start to hear more about that work. I do think that as a general matter, my sense is that legislators have, their expectation is that the governor is coming forward with a proposal around this question. The legislative committee that included Member Donegan and Kay Turan to look at university governance, when it came to the question of the state infrastructure, said, kind of threw up its hands and said, we're not really sure. We know the governor's working on something with the OEIB, so we'll wait and see what they come up with. At the same time, legislators always have ideas, so I think it's an important point.
I think it would be worthwhile, perhaps at a post-election meeting of the committee, to get the chairs of the education committees, so that the dialogue starts now. It's not a spring discussion about, we're sort of working at cross purposes. I know on the higher ed level, there's a fair amount of discussion of people putting legislative concepts in, and it just seems better to find out what's out there, so we can narrow the gaps before session starts.
That's a great point.
Is there anyone on the phone?
I don't think so. Are there any persons who join us by phone?
Okay. I'm going to suggest that we move forward in the agenda if there's no further comments, and move on to the invited testimony. I asked before, I know that Chancellor Bernsteiner and Director Paul Kelly are going to speak, or do we have any other So with that,
And Andrea.
Paul, George, were you intending to speak together? Okay, so why don't we invite you to step forward? Thank you. Director Paul Kelly is the chairman of the Governance and Policy Committee at the State Board of Higher Education, and to his right is Chancellor George Bernstein. Thank you for joining us very much today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair Donegan and members of the committee, Dr. Crew, Mr. Cannon, for inviting us to talk to you in response to the questions that you sent to us. The Chancellor and I will divide this up as we go. What you should have in front of you somewhere in your materials is a letter from both of us that has some attachment to it. That's probably a little dense to attempt to read as we're talking, so I discourage you from doing that. And we will give you an abbreviated outline of what we've covered in the letter. We hope we've understood your questions appropriately and responded accordingly, but there's certainly the possibility that we have not, and if you think we're off target here, I assume you'll feel free to interrupt us with questions, and of course we'll welcome the opportunity to answer questions at the end of the relatively short presentation that we'll make. Before we specifically address the questions you've raised, there are what we see as three broad principles that should guide, perhaps even determine the decisions you ultimately make on this topic. First of all, it's that 40-40-20 is and must be our collective goal. Whatever we do must improve our chances of achieving it. Secondly, achieving that goal requires three partners. On one hand is the state with its investment funding. Secondly are the universities who offer education, of course, to our students. And third is a statewide entity that establishes the framework within which universities operate and facilitates their success in achieving the state's goals. Thirdly is the need for revenue and new ways of gaining it from traditional and new sources, and partnerships is a key component and clearly is the role of the state and the OEIB. Now, educating students, especially Oregon students, is clearly the role of the universities. Facilitating the success of the universities in that role and in achieving the state's goals requires more than money and good intentions. It requires orchestration, innovation, regulation, and facilitation. Some entity must perform those tasks. The OEIB is focused on investor functions, sufficient appropriation support for effective operations, funding to achieve specified results, and money to increase educational attainment for more Oregonians than the universities have ever served, especially for groups of students with whom we have not been as successful in the past. Those would include students from low-income families, from rural areas, and from communities of color.
You'll note that those are a lot of the categories that you have in the Achievement Compacts, which relate directly to the investments that you currently make and intend to make as the state in student success here in Oregon. But we would argue that there is a variety of essential functions that are not investment functions that are necessary in order that you can be successful here in the state. And they are functions that cannot be performed solely and effectively by the individual universities. And I want to go through a little bit of those. They are what Paul talked about earlier with regard to the categories he mentioned as non-investment functions. First, there are what I will call the rules of engagement. If we weren't in the middle of a political campaign at the national level where the word regulation is a four-letter word, I would use the word regulations in a sense that provides a framework, the guardrails within which the universities operate. I'm going to give you a few examples of these, and they're not by any means exhaustive, but they're sort of illustrative of what we're talking about when you talk about a regulatory framework within which the universities would operate in the public interest. They include mission and program approval, which focuses on two dimensions, basically making sure that you have somewhere in Oregon the programs Oregonians need, but that you don't have so many of them that you have unwarranted duplication and competition for resources. That really was the fundamental reason that led to the creation of the state system in the first place, was the concern about, was one of the two concerns that led to that. One was about duplication of program. But duplication isn't the only thing. You have to worry about adequacy also. You have to make sure that you have the programs somewhere in the state that Oregonians need in order for the state and Oregonians to be successful. And that's why we have, in various parts of the state, different programs in different areas. That's why we have certain institutions that focus on, for example, engineering, but we don't have that everywhere because of the expense of doing so. Someone needs to provide the mission and program approval that leads to that kind of interlocking approach. The second are what I will call the standard definitions of student status. What the heck does that mean? Something as simple as who is a resident for fee-paying purposes can be among the most controversial discussions you can have in the state, particularly in a time of financial difficulty for institutions. One of the things that we spend considerable time on is, in fact, the residency rules and applying those with, even-handedness and consistency. But there are a lot of others as well that need to be considered. Standard measures of student progress and university finance are essential if the state is to manage its investments and determine and measure the value of those investments. I had a meeting a few weeks ago with someone at the national level who said that among the 50 states, there are 20 of them where the definitions, even though you'd think they were common, don't mean the same thing. You risk being one of those 20 if you don't pay attention to making sure that how you define who a student is, what kinds of student progress there is, how you account for the dollars spent on those students, and how it rolls up across the state. In fact, you want to have consistency in that, and really fundamentally your achievement compacts assume that consistency. But it has to be provided in some fashion. The third deal with the minimum admission standards that provide to Oregon students the education opportunities that they need somewhere in the state, even if not necessarily at their institution of first choice. And I mention that because we do have different admission standards that the Board of Higher Education adopts for the 7 institutions. But if you look across all of them and aggregate them, they're created so that Oregonians who are qualified to attend college always have some place to go in the state. And you got to have somebody who makes sure that you have some place for every qualified Oregonian to attend. Again, it may not be his or her first choice. That's not what we're saying, but you're saying you got to have the opportunity. And you also have to convey, and this gets back to the same issue of admission standards, what it is high school students ought to be able to achieve in order to go to any college, or in order to be admitted to any university. And so that's where you have all the course-taking patterns and minimum standards that have been established. Someone needs to make that link clear so the students understand what they're supposed to do. And finally, within the rules of engagement and regulation, there are statewide, system-wide policies, such as those that grant advanced placement credit on a consistent basis at all the universities, so the students know what's expected of them and what they can expect from us. So that kind of consistency gives you an opportunity to show students the path they need to take. And that, in fact, is not an investor function, but it's also not an individual university function. The second category of functions that are not investor functions, but are not regulations really, deal with orchestrating functions that cross institutional boundaries. And these include establishing frameworks for collaborative programs among the universities. We have joint degree programs. We have joint research efforts. But they also include collaborative frameworks for work with the community colleges, with the private universities, and with the K-12 schools. They include the policies and rules around transfers, such as the AAOT and the transfer module, developed in connection and collaboration with the community colleges, and the general effort that we have to enhance student success and remove barriers. Everything from minimum class size policies to financial aid policies across the whole system. Third, innovation and experimentation. Today, just today, for example, the OUS system is leading and facilitating faculty efforts regarding reverse transfer, learning outcomes assessment, aligning general education in the first year of college with the Common Core state standards, and determining how to assess credit for prior learning, including the completion of these massively open online courses. And then map that prior learning onto student degree paths. That's being done also with the community colleges. You may hear a similar statement from Cam Preuss or from Andrea, but the point is this is not an institutional thing. Why not? Why isn't it institutional only? And part of the reason is the financial and sometimes internal political issues. We have found that we can have conversations with faculty that individual presidents cannot have. Why? Because they are into the individual day-to-day operations. And so if you pull back a ways, you can actually find the common ground that transcends the individual arguments that might be going on. It is a statewide system function as opposed to a campus function. Obviously, the education takes place at the campus level, but providing experimentation, innovation, finding national grants to help facilitate that winds up being, again, a system-wide function to facilitate student success. And finally, there is the facilitation of university efforts to maximize revenue and reduce costs in order to devote more resources to direct instruction and to direct student services. And these can take the form of coordinated advocacy with the legislature, and that's really the second reason the system was created. But they also can deal with sharing services. And the State Board's Governance and Policy Committee is beginning work now on that very issue. I'm going to turn back to Paul for that discussion.
So as you may know, certainly as Chair Donegan knows, as the Chancellor said, the Governance and Policy Committee of the Board is looking at these efforts to implement a variety of cost savings and revenue enhancing programs that involve all 7 universities, taking advantage of opportunities that may have proven effective in other universities or other states. Collectively, we call this group of possibilities, if you will, shared services, and that term has appeared and been used by, or in the work of the Interim Legislative Committee on University Governance, which just concluded its work recently with its legislative concept recommendation. That committee, as you may know, did not delve into this shared services bucket, if you will. Our committee has been engaged in going through that bucket, if you will, and continues to do so, and will continue to provide our thoughts on it to both the legislature, the governor's office, and your committee to the extent that that would be useful. Some areas that already look promising in this category, and I'll back up a second, the attachment to the letter from the Chancellor and me that you have is essentially a matrix of what I'll broadly call that shared services bucket, and we could get into conversation about any one of them in particular if you would like on questions or perhaps at a future date with some further detailed conversation about that. But that is what that attachment addresses. So we are looking at some of those, and there's clearly already some indications of promise in the areas of purchasing, information technology, financial services, and research administration. But regardless of who provides the service, and we suggest that there are probably 3 possibilities there. One is a central entity, such as the Oregon University system. Another is a particular university for the benefit of the other universities in the system. And thirdly is another party entirely, basically a contracted party that we would go to provide the service if that's the most efficient and effective way of doing it. But the framework, regardless of who provides the service, the framework for collaboration must be established and maintained. But the aim must be to maximize the resources devoted to educating Oregon students effectively, both for direct instruction and direct student services. So this aim is best achieved, in our view, by a central services entity that is neither each single university on its own nor a state agency, but rather an entity like the Oregon University System and the Chancellor's Office, overseen by a citizen board to bring the best of business and community knowledge and practice to identifying and managing opportunities to make and save money. But back to your primary mission as we understand it. Investor functions are a state role and they're best performed through the OEIB. But the other functions that we've discussed also go beyond the operations of individual universities and demand a statewide entity overseen, as I said, by that citizen board and staffed by the professionals who have, by background and experience and training, the skills and knowledge to support that entity and perform the functions, to orchestrate the efforts of the individual universities and their partners toward reaching the 40-40-20 goal. We obviously now call that entity the State Board of Higher Education, whatever may be its future name and construct. And we recognize that that's presumably, or those two things, its future name and construct and makeup are in the mix. So with that, that covers what we had prepared to address and are happy to go into whatever questions you might have.
Thank you, Paul and George. I'll open it up to my fellow subcommittee members. Julie?
So, a couple questions, just in terms of the shared service. Having served on one of the largest school districts, school board in the state, there were certain things that Portland Public Schools had the capacity because of the economies of size to offer itself, whereas smaller school districts that didn't have sort of the economies of scale to provide, it made sense to have shared services. When I think about the different institutions, the size, there's great variation, and I'm wondering if you've gone through to look at whether some of the institutions just on their own, they have the economies of scale to offer their own services without the need for a shared services model, and that the beneficiary of a shared service model would be the smaller, both regional and OITs, just given their size, that not necessarily just all on their own. For example, you could have an internal performance auditor reporting to an institution, one of the larger ones, versus maybe one internal performance auditor would be adequate for the smaller universities in the state.
At this point, we're open to the complete range of possibilities. That's what the Governance Committee will be looking at over the course of the next, several meetings. I think one of the questions will be where you choose to draw the line and how you choose to draw the line. Do you make it completely elective on the part of each institution, which is one model, or do you make it elective on the part of some and not others based on scale? Or do you make it based on where you can maximize the value of the sharing? And in different cases, it may be different. And I'm going to give you an example here of where I think it may make some sense to share, but you may not share completely. I'm going to use research administration as an example. Oregon State University has the most robust research administration program in the state. They and OHSU, by definition, they would have to, because they have by far the largest research portfolios. The question then is, would the other campuses be able to save more money and, importantly, be able to comply more effectively with federal requirements were they to let OSU provide those services for them. And so then it becomes a question of whether or not you say everybody goes through OSU or everybody who doesn't have critical mass goes through OSU. And those are the conversations that we're going to have over the course of the next few meetings, is where does it make sense? Purchasing may be a little different, where you have opportunities to buy off big contracts at great discount. The actual purchasing is done at the local level. But the contracts may be statewide. They may be bigger than OUS. And the question then is, how do you create a flexible framework that lets you maximize the savings and, in certain cases, maximize investment and other income, because you have other things there where the pooling of cash and the tranching of the investments may make some sense as well. So we don't have a preconceived notion of how it comes out, but I think it's important that we open up everything. It was interesting to me when we first raised this with our presidents that the first example given was libraries. And it was raised by the University of Oregon president saying, well, you know, we all have libraries. Are there savings to be had there? And so you'll see that there are a variety of things in here you don't automatically think about. Now, we already are doing a lot in libraries, so it may not, that may not be one you take on. But some of the others, I think you probably would.
I mean, what would be interesting for me is to hear from the universities on where they see the maximized value, whether it's to provide the services themselves or a shared service. I know it's a similar model at the K-12. You have the ESDs providing some services, and I know for Portland, often it was much more direct to provide the services themselves versus going through yet another entity to have those services provided. And so they had a lot more flexibility than smaller districts, which really needed to get that sort of critical mass. So I think I'd be interested in hearing from the individual universities on sort of the big bucket items, not every single line item here, but which ones help them, if it's shared, help them achieve the 40-40-20 or cost savings, and which ones would they prefer to provide on campus, and then see if there's a sort of, you know, clear bucketing of those services.
George, you want to comment on that? I think what you would find is the same experience as described with the Portland Public School Systems, is that for the larger universities, there's they already achieved so much of the economies of scale on certain items that they would probably prioritize having the flexibility of operating themselves, just as you talked about with Portland. With the other smaller schools, I think they would see greater greater advantages to pulling together because they don't have. I think whatever we set up, we want to enable the flexibility for rather than etching in stone right now. I think what we want to do is enable the flexibility for the institutions to migrate over time in pursuit of innovation and opportunity.
And one thing that we learned in the governance committee meeting from an outside consultant is that the changes in information technology in the last 15 or 20 years since we last went through this, where we decentralized most things to the campus level, give opportunities for savings that weren't there then. And the question then is, what do you know, where is the balance in terms of what is appropriate? And it is also true, and I use research as an example, a large university may not, just because it's large, have the critical mass in every single area. Some of them do, but not all of them do. And so you can't draw, I think, a bright line as readily as that.
If I could add a little further to at least the thought that your question generates, Julia, another area that it seems to me provides a real opportunity for the state to achieve the 40-40-20 goal, which we mentioned was sort of the first principle I think that we have to operate under here, is in the distance learning platform and sharing of courses. I don't know that it's inherent in a coordinated effort among the 7 public universities that has to happen, but it seems to me inherently you have better opportunities in a coordinated effort there. So, for example, the University of Oregon or Oregon State may have greater course capacity, course selection capacity, and can put on distance learning courses and teach 1,000 people instead of 25 people at one sitting. But they may not have all of the pieces to fill in on a broader curriculum or curricula spectrum. And so if in this process the University of Oregon can partner, for example, with Eastern Oregon to fit courses together in a scheme that makes sense, that they can combine then in a distance learning platform, because you don't have the logistical problems of separate facilities in the traditional teaching. I think you can reach more students, we can educate more students, and have a better shot in that context to reach the 40-40-20 goal. And I think what's key there is that you've got to have some assurance of cooperation and coordination to get that benefit of the system.
In the rules of the road, you've talked about the mission, the State Board of Higher Education approves the mission of each university. So going forward, if we had institutional boards, do you still see that as being a state role, or would that be more of a local role? And the context in which I'm asking the question is, for community colleges, it's the local board that sets the mission of the institution, so you'll find different missions. I mean, they're similar in some ways, but there are different missions. The programs that we offer, there is some state oversight to make sure that there isn't duplication, but those programs come from individual colleges up to the state, not the other way around typically. So I'm just trying to sort out this state role and mission setting going forward.
Yeah, and I think the big issue here is because our campuses have different missions, they therefore offer different programs and and so you're in a situation that's a little bit different from the community colleges, in which they're not trying to offer something in a geographic area, but they're offering statewide. And that's why I think it's important that there be some state oversight of both the mission and the programs, because you're not talking about a local entity in this case determining the mission. You're talking about somebody that's statewide. If you look at if you go back into the historical record, a lot of the friction that led to the creation of the state system in the first place was around who got to offer different programs, U of O or OSU, and at one point we had virtually the same curriculum at both of the two institutions, and the state was saying, we can't afford that, that's too expensive for us. And it led throughout the 30s into a real clear demarcation of the mission and the programs of those two institutions, so that what you have today is a very different institution at Oregon State than you have at Oregon. That was viewed as being necessary for the state to be able to have the coverage it wanted in programs without having to make duplicate investments. And so I think you've got to have some state role in the mission and program approvals of institutions that are per force statewide institutions.
Don't you get that from the governor's appointment of the institutional board members? I mean, in theory, that's what you get when the governor appoints the State Board of Higher Ed. You get people who have a statewide view, and that the governor, when he's appointing, that's the model. Institutional board members, that they would have sort of the split screen or complementary. They're focused on the mission of the institution, but also they bring with it, they're an appointee by the governor.
You know, I think the real question here is whether or not you can have a way of interlocking the programs and the missions of all the institutions to meet a statewide? And can you do that with individual independent boards? I'm not sure I mean, there's not an obvious way that you can do that I see, without some sort of a state entity, defined however you define it, that takes a look at how all of them fit together.
Yeah, I think that's the only way you get mission compatibility and not mission overlap, because the institutional board for the U of O or Portland State or Oregon State presumably is going to focus on how that university best serves its students. But who on that institutional board will look at whether what that university is doing meshes effectively with the other universities in our public system so that the state collectively gets the best benefit from the structure?
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, I think it's important to distinguish between mission and programs, and there is a school of thought. Actually, I hear, Julia, advanced by proponents of local boards. That basically says the state should really focus on the missions. If the missions are adequately structured and done very, very well periodically, then the need for subsequent program approval should be very, very minimal. Because you'll get down to rare episodes of interpretation around the missions. But if the state, through what, as you say, George, through whatever entity does the right work on the front end with the individual institutions, then the program should become fairly self-evident. I'm interested in your experience, George, as to whether or not you think that's realistic.
No. And I'll tell you why. And it's in an institution's perceived self-interest to push the boundaries. And typically what happens is they push the boundaries in the metro area because that's where the population is.
Yep.
And in so doing, it sets up friction with the institutions we already have in the metro area. And the question then is, because many of the programs can be subsumed within a mission. We're not saying the only engineering program will be at Oregon State or at Portland State. We're not saying that. So where we've seen the friction really has been there, and it has been basically in areas where people thought that, well, if we could get a foothold here, then we can build critical mass, and then the other institution says, but that's going to hurt us.
Sure.
And we spend a lot of time, we spend time figuring out how to optimize the situation for the state to...
How frequently do those negotiations or disputes, if you will, occur?
To get to me, there's only one or two a year.
Right.
To get to the Provost Council, I presume they do a lot more of that back and forth.
Okay, so just to continue that, if you had pretty good missions out on the front end, and you had the provosts continuing to negotiate, and then in the rare case of not being able to resolve things between themselves, you had some, mediator or arbitrating entity. How might that function? Does that sound like that's operable?
Yeah, I mean, in the main.
It's basically what you're
It's
saying.
basically what we do,
What's happening.
and it's just a question of how you do it and who does it, but it's,
And does
you
that reflect
don't
the
want to
fact that-
squelch individual institutional initiative. You
Right.
do not want to do that,
Right.
so that's,
So I think that gets to the question around what Mary was asking is, in that case, what you are describing is what you were saying is it's coming from the bottom up. This is not some edict that's coming down from the chancellor's office. They're identifying opportunities and they're trying to resolve potential disputes between themselves in the case of the rare situation when they can't they bring that forward, which is operable.
Mhm.
Okay?
I think this discussion highlights for me that, when we're looking at higher ed writ large, there are the issues that the universities have as statewide entities, and then community colleges that are very reflective of the local community, governed by elected boards, and it's going to be a challenge for us as we think about the state governance to make sure that we're not setting up policies that, that we set up policies, I'll say it in the positive, set up policies that work for the universities and for the community colleges, and they may not be the same.
Yeah.
Because of history, tradition, and the way we do the work and the mission of each community college and each university. So, in other words, it's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fits-all when we think of community colleges and universities.
I would just point out, this discussion of missions and programs is one of the sort of classic cases where the establishment of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission created some, I think, confusion because the State Board of Higher Ed has historically had this goal or had this power, and the Higher Education Coordinating Commission also is empowered or encumbered, depending on how you look at it, with statutory language that suggests that they have a role to play in defining goals and missions for community colleges and for public universities after receiving recommendations from the appropriate governing board. But that's one of the real tension points in this work.
Any further questions, Julie?
Well, I just, I guess I wanted to comment and be interested in your sort of thoughts back. In the letter at number 3, it says increasing resources, more revenue for our 7 universities should be the state's, and especially the OEIB's #1 critical function and support of higher ed. So when I look through Senate Bill 909, it's not, it's about directing investment, hiring a chief education officer, streamlining and integrating a pre-K through 20 system, not necessarily producing more revenue, although it's probably not precluded. And I know that during our confirmation hearing, since I was on the first panel, there was several questions about whether that was the role of OEIB, and it was not my understanding of that's the role of this board. So I'm sort of interested in your thoughts about it. Since we're not the legislature, we don't have the power to appropriate funds. We certainly can make the case that to get to 40-40-20, these are investments that should be made, or these are best practices that should be invested in. But I don't see how this board would directly sort of and make that our #1 critical function. So if you could elaborate.
You just answered it in a way, though, because you don't get to 40% and 40% with the current level of investment. And so part of it is making that case, which is from your role as the investor. We don't have enough money to invest if this is the outcome you want to get.
Yeah, to second that, I agree, and I think you, the OEIB, and Dr. Crew are the new persuasive voice in the neighborhood, if you will, on the funding of education, not just higher ed, but education in Oregon. And you may have the most credibility and the most compelling presentation to make to go down that path. And recognize you don't have a checkbook to write, but
Yeah, so maybe it's
you've
the
got
way
the
it's
bully pulpit.
phrased of revenue versus investment. So what we haven't done yet as a board is to go through and look at the resources that are available to different institutions or different school districts, and then what sort of outcomes they're getting, because I think probably the first order of business is, can we spend the money that we currently have more effectively, or could we invest in what would be sort of best practice, what's been demonstrated to be best practice in a school district or at an institution, and translate that to another district or an institution. So it's more of a, what are the most effective investments with the money we have versus that we're going to be increasing revenue per se. So that seems like that's maybe the second set of, the second phase of the discussion versus just starting off right off the bat of more money into the system without looking at how are we currently utilizing the resources we have or that are at the state level, but also at the individual district level. I noticed, for example, the Beaverton School District has just a couple thousand less students than Portland, and yet they have $200 million more in order to educate the students in the school district. So, you know, what can we learn from what, and I think the outcomes in Beaverton are probably comparable, if not, you know, better in some cases. So, you know, what can we learn about those investments? So I just think we have to be careful about setting expectations that that's going to be our primary goal versus that first sort of the analysis, and then what that analysis leads us to in terms of our current set of resources before going right into, and I've said, not hesitant to go into the second part of the conversation. It's just, it seems premature and not necessarily what Senate Bill 909 laid out for us in terms of our role.
And I take your point, and I'm not arguing that you should not do exactly what you talked about. But I'm also suggesting that to expect that we'll have 40% more degrees and no more money is not a realistic assessment. And so having some way of conveying that message as well, not that it necessarily results in appropriation right away, but it sets an expectation that in future you're going to have more money state even if we are as efficient as it's possible to be, even if we use all the best practices, that to get the kind of results that the state is talking about will involve additional state resources at some point, or you're not going to reach that.
I think it's just outside the purview of this governance and policy committee.
Yeah.
I mean, I think your point's exactly right. I mean, not only getting to the 40, but also increasing quality and also serving underrepresented students and low-income students. All these stack up on the costs, and so we don't have adequate resources. It's not the purview of this subcommittee. Before we wrap up, Rudy, did you have something else?
I just wanted to follow up on something I heard earlier, so I apologize for stepping out. As I read through the testimony and I was hearing you articulate it, I guess the question in my mind was, you know, how far afield in your mind is this structure from what you ideally would like to see in a 40-40-20 world? I mean, if you were able to say, you know what, hey, listen, we're just fine, you know, everything is just exactly as it should be, governance structures are what they are, reporting relationships are what they are, functions work the way that they should work. If someone would be willing to listen to that, is your position that, you know, listen, we're really close and we'll only have to tweak a little bit, or is your position that, listen, there's a whole lot of daylight between where we are now and what the governance structure optimally should look like in order for us to be able, I mean, you have the same sentiment as it was related to the 40, as it related to the financial commitments. I guess I'm asking this now from a structural standpoint.
Well, let me start and then I'll let Paul correct me, because we've been down this road now for several years, and we made in the 2011 session a major shift in structure when we, you know, essentially stopped being a state agency. A lot of the things with shared services, for example, will be enabled by not having to be a state agency. And that's why I don't want those issues conflated so you wind up with a state agency providing shared services. That's the worst of all possible outcomes. given what we've already gone through. So the first thing I want to say is we've seen and are implementing now a major shift, probably the most major shift in the 80 years that we've existed. The second thing is we then proposed in June a sort of a framework for institutional boards that showed what it was that a state board would do and what it was that an institution would do. What we said at that time, and I think Ed Ray notes it in his comments, what the board said at that time is these are the functions that could be done by an institutional board, which is virtually all operations of institution, or by the president of an institution without an institutional board. And somehow in the discussion with the legislative committee, that last piece didn't really get carried over, but that really is what the board proposed in June. So that all of the operations basically become within the purview of the institution, however governed. And so those are two major shifts. One already happened, one in proposal. If you were to ask me where I might go after that, really the question, if you look at how are you going to make sure that students succeed, what do we need to do to make that happen? Well, we have to find a way to get more resource. We talked about that, and I think the institutions may have more flexibility to do that under the proposal in June than they may have had before. So that begins to address that part of the issue. And we asked you to help us with the second part, which was the state investment. But the third thing that I really do think we need to spend some more time on is how to connect, and we've got some work underway now that I'm going to actually talk to Rob Saxon about tomorrow as well. How do we better connect with the high school? How do we make sure that if we are going to adopt the Common Core state standards, which we are, if we are going to in fact assess every student at the end of the 11th grade, which we are, how do we then make sure that those students who can accelerate in that 12th grade get the exact same curriculum that we would give them if they came to the university? So that we're aligned all the way through in order to make sure that not only are they getting more credits, but they're getting the right ones that will accelerate degree production. How do we then use that 12th grade also to deal with the developmental education and remedial issues that students have so that we don't have the community colleges spending 40-odd% of the first year, whatever the thing is, dealing with that issue so that I don't know that those are governance as much as they are thinking through how we will use the tools that are about to become available in order to ensure student success. Maybe that's governance. It may have dimensions of it, but mostly it's how do we figure it out together, because it crosses all of the organization lines. It's the universities, it's community colleges, and it's K-12. And yet it's an opportunity that we've not had before, and and we now have you guys who can help us do that. And whether you do it through investment, you do it through facilitation, or you do it through governance, of the three, I think governance is probably the least effective and the most controversial. But, that's where I'd want to spend some time. Because I think we're moving in the other directions, on the other ones.
If I may, Dr. Crew, just to add a couple of thoughts. I generally agree with what George has said, so I won't belabor that. I guess a couple of things I'd add is just the opportunity for us all to let Senate Bill 242 and the opportunities it has given us to play out. I mean, we actually only went into full effect of that law July 1, 3-4 months ago. So the opportunity for us to play that out, I think, is important. And then on institutional governance, institutional level or board governance, as George said, the state board made a unanimous recommendation to the legislative committee, I think at our June meeting, supporting that path and building, at least recommending rather, a structure under which those institutional boards could conceivably come to be. Starting early in the process, a couple of years ago, when we began to get into this, I was a skeptic is probably the right word, on institutional governing boards. I have moved significantly personally in the learning process over time. We have been told repeatedly by the experts that there is no perfect governance structure for higher ed, that you would simply go to and say, if you're smart, this is the one you will adopt. And so it is circumstantial. One of the things that has been presented most frequently as a reason to us, that is the Board of Higher Ed, as a reason for institutional governance, is the opportunity to enhance revenue through private philanthropy, et cetera. And I believe that that is one of the reasons that justifies going down that road to put that to the test, to see if that truly can play out. The other thing I'd add to what George said about the better connection with high schools, and I think he said community colleges as well, and I just wanted to add to that. We have collectively got to do better at enhancing the interrelationship between higher ed and the community colleges. And one that to me is a good example of where the coordination is working well is between Oregon State and Central Oregon Community College. I mean, there is a really good thing developing there, and that is just through the good efforts on both sides of that table. And we need to be doing more of that kind of thing. And basically, I think collectively, just avoiding doing anything that hinders that path. Probably getting out of the way is as much help as we can provide, and avoid hindering the path. And if I can add something that I might regret adding, just a personal perspective, I think, and actually Ben, you touched on it before, you mentioned a tension point out there. I think on the table collectively we're looking at one too many entities in the mix here on the higher ed community college level. And there is a challenge that we face in sorting out the relationship among the OEIB, HEC, and the Board of Higher Ed. And I think that needs to be sorted out in whatever we construct going down the road here, because I think we actually have presented ourselves with all good intention with a risk of complicating things by virtue of, as I said, one too many entities at play, I think.
Okay. Any final questions? Okay. Paul, George,
Thank
you
you.
very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
For the opportunity.
Thank you. Sorry. Right there. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. For the record, I'm Andrea Henderson, Executive Director of the Oregon Community College Association, and I'm joined today by a couple of members of our governance committee to help inform the conversation as we talk about what community colleges need from the state. So I'm joined by Joanne Truesdale, who's the president of Clackamas Community College, Connie Green, who's the president of Tillamook Bay Community College, and Ed Dotson, who's a board member from Schmeketa and our past chair of OCCA. And I do have a handout today that is a draft of some of the work that our governance committee has been doing. So let me start first by talking a little bit about OCCA as an organization. We are a council of governments of the 17 community colleges and are in our 50th year right now. And we are governed by a board, a 34-member board, which is the president of each college. And then additionally, each locally elected board, 7-member board, elects a board member from that board to serve on the OCCA board. And we are a place where the 17 community colleges can convene to talk about areas of mutual interest, whether it be our legislative advocacy, specific programs that the colleges would like to pursue, or any other items that really should be done collectively by the 17 colleges rather than individually. We have, as I mentioned, a governance committee that has been looking at governance issues from the statewide level for a number of years, and we've had a number of iterations of some type of governance committee to ask these questions. And what I'd like to do today is talk about two themes that really kind of underpin a lot of our conversations around state level structure, and then get into the specific questions that were posed. As we talk about the state level structure and governance for community colleges, a couple of really key themes that are important to colleges. First is the idea of the local governance of the community colleges, that we have a locally elected board, and that as community colleges, one of the key components is that we reflect the needs of that local community. And so the colleges do tremendous work to ensure that each of their programs is designed to meet that local community needs, that the mixture of programs that they have, the difference between career technical, the number of transfer, and how they really operate as colleges is designed to meet that community need. And so each of our colleges will look somewhat differently throughout the state because they have that basis in their community. And then secondly, as we talk about any type of structure between the state and the local colleges, one theme that we keep coming back to is that it's not necessarily the boxes, but it's the partnership and the communication between the state level and the local level that's really key. And as community colleges, we feel that we have a very effective system in Oregon right now that we really like in terms of how the colleges operate with each other and how they operate with the state, with both my office, with Cam's office, and the partnership that's created between all of us, so that there is a sense of a shared direction amongst all 17 colleges that's supported by the state level, and that collectively all of us are working together on the same agenda, where we each have different pieces of how we accomplish that agenda, but it's a joint and collaborative effort. We talk as 17 colleges as not being a system of colleges, but working to act systemically and to really act collaboratively with each other. And then that's an incredibly important value that has helped us with the work that we've achieved over the last several years. And that as we talk about any changes, that it be critical that any changes not disrupt the partnerships and the collaboration that we have, but anything that happens really be designed to enhance what we can do. And then the third area that we talk about quite frequently as conversations around state level governance and structure come up is that often it seems that the conversation becomes, well, what to do with community colleges. Do community colleges fit in the K-12 box with the State Board of Education where we are now? Do they fit in the higher ed box with the university system? And we're uncomfortable with either answer because as community colleges, we have equal ties with the K-12 system. We have ties with the university system. We have ties with the workforce system. We have ties with the business community. We have a role to play in economic development. That really we are the connectors that connect many of those systems together at that local community level, and want to ensure that any type of statewide structure really values all of those different connections and allow us to continue to do the work that works well and be connected to each of those different systems in a way that's effective. So those are three kind of the principles that kind of underlie our conversations. So as we look at the specific 4 questions that were posed in the memo that was sent out last week, what I distributed to you doesn't directly answer those 4 questions, but does represent the work of our governance committee. And so I wanted to bring that in because it's a collaborative conversation amongst our colleges to really define our criteria in terms of what it is that colleges would like to see from the state level. A caveat with this, it does say draft on it. It has not gone to the OCCA board yet and has been discussed at both the governance committee level, which is both board members and presidents, and has also been discussed at the president's council level. But as colleges, we try to ensure that what we do say does represent all 17, and it goes through our processes, and this is not finalized yet, so I do want to have that caveat. And in this document that we began drafting several months ago, we wanted to start with the question of function. and what is it that the 17 colleges need from the state level before we start talking about any type of structure, so that as the conversation turns to structure, we can look at any proposals and say, okay, does it meet this criteria? Does it accomplish what we need? So if I could briefly go through, I think, some of the highlights from what we've identified in this criteria that are really important. And the first, it should be no surprise coming from community colleges, is that sense of local governance. And we think local governance works. We think it's one of our strengths because it does allow for that local community needs to be met. And the colleges really want to see from any kind of state level structure an understanding and support and enhancement of that local governance, so that it really is that strong partnership where the state can do just what the state should do to help the colleges accomplish the great work that they do at the local level. And that really needs to be key in any type of structure. And I think hand in hand with that is really our second point, which is around the comprehensive mission of the community colleges. The colleges have multiple parts of that mission. It doesn't fit neatly into any one box. And what we really hope for from the state is a really deep understanding and commitment to that comprehensive mission. That we do have a role to play in those that have less than a high school education, whether it's be through our partnerships with K through 12s or from adults that need help with literacy or remedial education. We have a role to play in career and technical development that is critical. We work with our local businesses to provide the services that local businesses need. We have workforce training programs. We play a large role in transfer for students that move on to the universities, all of which are equally important and want to make sure that the state recognizes and supports that. And then to really ensure that the state policies are reflective of that comprehensive mission in both the funding structures and the decision-making structures. And then I think really thirdly, in terms of what the state needs from the state, if you look on the back page, is really that leadership role that can be provided from the state. We have a great system right now, particularly with Cam Preuss and her office in CCWD, and the way CCWD really plays a leadership role to help the colleges move forward on critical initiatives. And what's, I think, really works well with that role is that at times it's Cam's office and CCWD that plays the lead to say, here's a direction I think that we all need to go, and then works collaboratively with the colleges to make it happen. And other times, it's innovation that comes from the college level, that CCWD can then support, help bring to scale, and help make it actually happen. And so it's sometimes one leads, sometimes the other, but it's always done collaboratively in a way that I think really moves the agenda forward for community colleges. We want to make sure that continues in whatever type of structure is created or changed at the state level, that there is that sense of support and partnership around key education initiatives, that there is assistance that's needed from the state level to provide research, best practice information, and other types of information that can help colleges to really maximize what it is that they're doing. We also need at the state level that creation of partnerships with other sectors that belongs appropriately at the state level, whether it's with the university system, the K through 12 system, the workforce system, the employment division, economic development, and all of those areas to ensure that those partnerships are in place. And then we also need an information infrastructure that will help both at the state level and at the college level to really take a look at the data and use it to drive excellent decisions. And then finally, our last main bullet point is there is that administrative function that is necessary at the state level that the colleges need. There is a role for appropriate administrative rules that need to be promulgated to oversee the functions of community colleges. Ours are fairly limited right now, and for the most part are developed in collaboration with the colleges, so that by the time a proposed administrative rule arrives at the State Board of Education, the colleges have all had input, and it's been developed in a way that there is support throughout. It never really is an advocacy situation between the colleges and the State Board, but really a collaborative partnership so that they're developing them together. We need a place at the state level for the distribution of state dollars and the mechanisms by which the state dollars will be allocated between the colleges, and that is an important state role. There are some audit functions that are necessary at the state level that are currently performed by CCWD to ensure that both the money allocated to the colleges and the FTE counts from the colleges are accurate. And there also is a role at the state level to take a look at the process for new college degree and certificate programs and assure that there's not a duplication of efforts. And again, that's done very well where those, all of the programs are developed at the local level, sent forward to the state, where colleges can then weigh in and say, well, you know, this college is doing this and perhaps this one isn't necessary, and have that collaborative conversation about that creation of the new degrees and certificates. So this is really our attempt to define the criteria that we would like to see from the state. And then again, as stated earlier, to use this criteria so that as there are suggested changes, we can ensure that those changes meet these criteria. So that doesn't fully answer all 4 of your questions, but I wanted to represent the work that has been done collaboratively as the first part of that answer, which I think really gets to your first question in terms of the critical functions. The second question that you posed in terms of how are these best performed, it really is, I think, on each of these a combination between both staff and the whatever type of citizen board or commission. The system we have now, again, it works very well because Cam and her staff work very collaboratively. And again, when things get to the state board, there is a role for the state board to adopt the rules, to adopt the distribution model. But it's done with generally agreement from all 17 colleges by the time it gets to that point. Additionally, there are times when the State Board Executive Committee and the OCCA Executive Committee meet together so that as specific items are proposed, we're in alignment with those proposals. I think the best example of that is with the funding request for the community colleges and the capital construction request. And the 2 executive committees meet jointly to talk about the foundation and criteria for those requests. And so we get to a place so that by the time my board adopts our legislative ask and the state board adopts what goes on to the governor's office, they're the same and they're in alignment with each other. And then your third and fourth questions also asked about the non-investor functions. And I think that there are considerable non-investor functions that as community colleges currently are in place, but it's done in collaboration with the 17 colleges. And it happens in a multitude of forums, and again is, I think, indicative of that partnership. So that the college presidents meet in a president's council and work collaboratively. We have the Council of Instructional Administrators, and they have specific initiatives that they work on collaboratively. Council of Student Service Administrators. Again, there's multiple ways within the community college world that works very effectively to bring forward specific ideas, work on them in a collaborative manner, so that each college can implement them in the way that makes the most sense for their unique mission and unique needs of their community, but yet the resources are shared and the conversations are shared collaboratively, so we get to a place where it might look differently, but it's all going the same direction. And I think that as we look at the state structure needs to, again, support that collaboration amongst the colleges. So that at the end, decisions that are made, areas that the colleges are working on, everybody has a sense of buy-in to that final destination. They're committed to the process, and they feel like they all have equal input into that process, and that it's a shared direction and a shared responsibility, which I think is critical to actually making change happen. In closing, I think the community colleges are very committed to a sense of continuing to change how we function as community colleges. How can we best serve our students? How can we have greater outcomes for our students? How can we have greater student success in our initiatives? And in doing that, want to do that in that collaborative spirit so that we can continue to make the change and have it actually occur. I'm going to stop there and see if there's additional comments from my partners up here at the table, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that, so like Joanne, did you want to add anything?
Actually, thank you. I'm Joanne Truesdon, president of Clackamas Community College. I think 2 things that Andrea touched on. The Truman Commission, when we were first kind of ubiquitously spread throughout the nation, described us as a network. And so fundamental in why we were created was to be a network, and that network was to be specifically for the unemployed, veterans education, and to ensure equity and opportunity in education, regardless of where an individual lived. And I think that that is something that often gets overlooked as it relates to our role in post-secondary education. So I think that's one of the reasons why, as Andrea was describing how we work together, why we fundamentally work together in that way, and why within our different institutions we may have different mixes of programs, simply because that's what our community needs in order to serve our students. And the other piece around the non-investor functions is some of the key elements that occur for us are statewide degree programs, so that a student, there might be 4 or 5 of the community colleges regionally situated that might have a 2-year degree program that is best coordinated among 4 or 5 of us, and that way all 17 aren't trying to provide the same. It's a very inefficient model. So a statewide degree program assures that we are blanketing everywhere and students have the same opportunity. For example, an apprenticeship is an excellent way. Once you finish a journey level apprenticeship, we all have a way through a statewide degree program that an apprentice, a journey level apprentice, can get a 2-year degree in apprenticeship and use that to leverage on for further education. And then from the standpoint of a local control, I just was thinking about this in terms of the investor component. And when I think about the fact that you all have gotten property taxes recently, and when you look at your community college expenditures, my community now locally pays 70% of the educational costs, whether it be through tuition or through property taxes. And so they have a very large interest in what happens locally through that board, and they make it known about what they need, whether they be a business or an individual. In 7-8, going backwards, in 7-8, it was more of an investor partnership of 46% from the state and 49% local. And so there's a much easier way to navigate when we're all in this together, and it makes sense. When we start pulling away from each other, that investor component partnership piece is really important to get to the goals. But what becomes even more critical are these things that keep us connected to each other and networked with each other, networked with the Oregon Investment Council, our K-12 partners, and our university partners. Because that's where we can get efficiency and that's where we can move people through the system. So thanks.
Connie or Ann, would you like to add anything?
I wish Dr. Crew was here. He asked a question of George about, are you okay where you're at, or do you need to change in the governance? And one of the observations since the last session is that truly community colleges weren't advocating to change anything. Community colleges weren't advocating for heck. Community colleges were just trying to serve students, and really glad about how we did it, how we worked together. And as all the governance started rolling out, it was like, well, it really won't affect us because we're doing all the things and it works really well. So as you put together a governance committee for Oregon Investment Board, and as I understand the issues between OUS and between others who look at this, truly community colleges have been a first responder to their communities. Whether you partner with your high school well, which I think I do really well at Tillamook, and ask Randy Shield, we've got some great examples going on at Tillamook, or whether I partner with Oregon State, which I love what I do with Oregon State, with Ed Ray and Open Campus, or I talk about my Chamber of Economic Development, all those things are great. Really my energy is local. And when I need to learn something, I call one of my 16 peers, or I put something out, I ask Commissioner Price, what is so-and-so doing? And I get answers, I get responses. Actually spending time on governance is like, would you just really let us keep doing things locally, because it really works, and can I really just call Cam and Andrea when I have a connection, because it really works. I appreciate what you need to do, but truly, when something is working, please don't break it. It is working very well. I had the opportunity to serve on a couple of student success committees for both CAM and also for the legislature. And I watch what we're doing, and we're moving things. We're talking, we're changing best practices, and we're doing it because it makes sense for students. We're changing investments, what we do locally, because it makes best for students and their completion. It's not because someone told us to, it's because it's the right thing to do. When you live in the community, you run into people at your Safeway, your Fred Meyer. We don't have some of these other fancy stores in Tillamook. We only have those two to go to. But when you go to those two, you run into people and you have to face them every day. I feel like we're doing the best stuff possible. So I would just hope whatever you do, form really does fall function and you don't mess up the good work that we do by accident. Please really think about unintended consequences of a box or a label, because we're so much more than either a box or a label.
I'll just add just a few words about perspective from an individual board member. It's really a unique position we're in. It's a local board, but it's a board position, it's a board responsibility that calls for your perception, including the individual student or small group of students, workers or small group of workers who are out of work. It asks you to look at the needs of your district. In fact, even before that, your individual high school. And it's really interesting. For example, one of the positions we operate from that's very heavy in our minds at Chemeketa is when we realize 9 of the 10 poorest elementary districts in the state are in our region. It influences our programs significantly. Our financial picture is significantly influenced by that. So you have the individual high schools, and then you have our 3-county region. But what's even greater, you have that small to larger perspective, but then on top of that is the statewide perspective that's managed through OCCA and CAM's office. It is working very, very well. And it's accomplishing a great deal. It's led to some changes at Chemeketa and individual colleges that will enhance the 40-40-20 tremendously. We've had in the last 4 years at Chemeketa 1,000 students who have received free tuition for their grades, for their work at the high school level. That's significant. And it's important that operate, but it's not important, it's important that not be forced on anyone else. We have partnerships with each or with a number of the universities. There's a change that I hope we can work on. We really refer to those, whether it's high school to us or us to the 4-year, we talk about those as transfers. I would like to see us start to look at those as transitions. If we're going to be successful with 40-40-20, we have to have a responsibility that says we're going to walk with individual students hand in hand through this process. It's not theirs to search out and find. We need to help them, and that's why the local board can do that.
So we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and start. First of all, just in case there's any curiosity, message received. I guess heard and read the word local a few times here in the last 20 minutes, and so I can speak as one committee member that was not lost on me anyway. One question that, and it's my impression, mostly from Mary through the years, but also today, is that it seems one of the things that works well is that the operations of the community colleges are very local and very bottom up, but that you do collaborate where it makes sense. It's very sensible, very practical. It's not imposed. It's almost somewhat voluntary, and that I understand that we don't all need to recreate the wheel, and when it comes time to share or pool, that you willingly do that. As you think about community colleges and potentially our university systems, is there any low-hanging fruit that we're missing right now in terms of potentially broadening the pool, if you will, beyond the 17 community colleges to seek sharing with the universities as well. And then I'm looking at Ed Ray's comments around legal services, auditing, IT, I mean, kind of classic back office stuff that nobody wants to spend the money on if they don't have to. I mean, are there opportunities as you look beyond the community colleges to save a buck?
I think most of us actually already partner on the ways. I look at how I partner with the ESD on certain areas. I partner with Randy Shield on certain areas. So there's a lot of times that you look at the cost, and I think you choose locally how to do that and get the best resources from that. So that I'm not, I believe there could be more, but I look at how most of us already do a lot of other things where we use others' cost-sharing agreements. Oftentimes on legal counsel, because I'm a small community college, I oftentimes will call someone else. I can use Mary's, I can use Cam can assist me, I can use OCCA Karen, so it's something, depending on what it is, oftentimes I get assistance. I've called Randy Shield at Tillamook School District, and I've gotten his assistance. So often, it's amazing when you're local and you share these things. Oftentimes you already do some of those things, Matt. It doesn't mean it isn't more, but there's a lot of actual sharing on all the 17 campuses that are based on the lowest cost you can get to get a service done possible.
I spent 9 years with Portland Community College before I came to Clackamas. And one of the things that I was very interested in is this question of where weren't we using kind of the efficiency component of the more we purchased collectively together. The challenge that we have is we are so leanly staffed currently that our IT infrastructure, even when we go to the cloud, needs the same number of people than if we keep it going and we don't have the conversion cost. And so there are things, individual collective bargaining agreements, that are very different between. So it's difficult to share HR departments because we have different ways of managing and different responsibilities and different requirements in our collective bargaining agreements. And we have 3 collective bargaining agreements at our institution. And so start managing those multiple, and it becomes very complicated. That being said, we have used broad-based things, similar to what Connie described. So we do work with our ESD on a number of items. We have our regional high school at our campus so that the high schools don't have to have career technical education and have that there, and we can jointly purchase some of that equipment. Financial aid processing, we are going back and forth finding other part-time financial aid so that if we're behind, we can go and call a different financial aid office and have them come over. The challenge is truly that there is a cost to change, and at the moment, I would say that the benefit analysis is not there to say we've maximized about as where we can go. What's next? I'm facing another $1 million of cuts this coming year, and you can bet I'm asking that question over and over again. And so far, it still is too costly to get to a different spot. And when we put those together, whoever I bond with, their cost may be much more expensive than mine. And so, it's kind of drawing on some of the issues that cropped up during K-12 consolidation back in the 90s.
George mentioned libraries. I mean, that was one of the big items that we discussed in the governance and policy. And just Mike Opperson was focusing enormous numbers in terms of just scale purchasing and procurement. Are we taking full advantage of those opportunities, particularly across the universities?
We're connected, interconnected with libraries to the point that we can be. And for accreditation purposes, we have to have a library, and we could, if we had a university right next door, down a block, create that consolidation for a library. But since we don't,
In terms of purchasing?
Purchasing, we have model contracting rules that when we do joint purchasing, a couple of examples we've done on a statewide basis has been some of our distance learning functions any kind of economic modeling functions. When I think we've also done some things around, I'm trying to remember, it comes up, but I'd be happy to get back to you, certainly with a list that we participated in.
We looked at that with health insurance.
Health insurance, yes, thank you.
So do all the community colleges do it, or is it an opt-in? So it sounds like what's being described in some ways is sort of voluntary or more ad hoc or just community-related shared services. Are there platforms that are required shared services, or most of them opt in? Like there's an advantage to Clackamas Community College to participate in the model contracting or whatever it is. What's the sort of default? Is it you have to opt in, or here's the base and you have to opt it out?
I think for almost everything we do as community colleges, it's done in that collaborative fashion. There isn't a place where somebody says you will do this. But because it's done collaboratively and we try to get the perspective of all 17 colleges, when it makes sense for all the colleges to do that, they will go forward. There are times that 15 colleges may say, we all want to partner with this, and we've got a couple of colleges say, well, it doesn't make financial sense for us, or we want to focus on this over here, whatever the case may be. And there's that freedom to form those partnerships as necessary or not form them as it makes sense.
So on the statewide program that you mentioned, where you have 5 counties. Okay, what happens if you don't resolve that and what's the 5 of you?
Well, it's been incredibly rare. I can't even think of the last time that community colleges went to the commissioner for adjudication. But for mediation perhaps, but not for adjudication. But I do know where it usually comes in for us is that when we go out for a program, because we are both potentially a certificate, a 1-year degree, a 2-year degree, and then transfer to a 4-year degree, our competitiveness might be influenced, or someone may challenge us who's private for-profit, private nonprofit, other universities who might be offering AA degrees in Oregon, and other community colleges. And so while we do a really good job of trying to figure out who all is doing everything, you never know until it reaches Cam's office and the comment period goes out that somebody may be upset.
So what happens if it doesn't get resolved?
But oftentimes, it gets resolved, because what happens is we don't compete against each other. It's been very different if we were competing against each other. We're not, and we all have usually less resources from the state, except for maybe 1 or twice, 2. Sometimes we get more resources, so it's usually less resources. So what you do is, because you're not competing, your business officers are talking about the same problem. So when we start talking about PERS, we start talking about insurance, we start talking about negotiations, or your student services people are talking about what do you do with early alerts? How do you get students success? Do you have a mandatory class? Your chief academic officer. So what you have is this very pragmatic, similar issues, and people start sharing the issues. And then they problem solve the issues, and usually we all, whether they all is 10 or 17, go the similar direction, because pragmatically, you've learned the best practice, someone has started it, and you cannot afford not to do a best practice that's pragmatically going to save you a resource. So what happens almost consistently is that there's a broad conversation, and you weigh in where it makes sense. The reason we all have different IT systems has to do much more with how the 17 are funded. It was enabling legislation. You start out figuring out where you are, and some got into certain banner systems, some are on Genzabar systems, but some are on RogueNet. But it was chosen locally, but even then, when we try to do something together, we try to share how we do that. Is there a way to the occurs database or the New Alder database, trying to work together? But most of the time, it is so pragmatic. It's kind of like, it'd be different if we're competing. Truly, everyone is trying to bring down the cost, and if someone finds an answer to bring down the cost, you almost always jump there unless there's something in your contract that stops you. So it's really a pragmatic answer to how you resolve these, and because these groups meet quarterly, it's amazing how they take on our issues for us, and there's a lot of cross-sharing from the 17. It is not a competitive environment.
I think what really is the foundation of that is the 17 colleges, the people that work in the colleges, the board members, are focused on the students first. And so as everything is filtered through, what is it the students need, and how can we best serve those students? it leads to decision-making that's very collaborative. It's not about what the institution's needs, but it's always focused on that student. And student defined as students throughout Oregon. So how can we collaborate to help those students? And there's many times that colleges will advocate another college's interest because that interest is higher than their own at the moment, and that's what the students need. I think that's very indicative in our capital construction project, where colleges will advocate another college's project over their own because that need is higher at the moment. And that happens because we do focus on those students.
I have a just question. When I look at your side of the complicated diagram here, it looks, there's fewer arrows and sort of matrixing. I'm wondering how you would describe, if I look at this clearly, local controls driving a lot of the work, the operational, the governance pieces. How would you describe the most important function of the State Board of Education in terms of your work? Is it that administrative rules piece, or what is it that they offer? Is it the connection to the K-12 system? What is it that adds value to that relationship? Because it sounds like you all could cooperate and work among yourselves locally.
I think at a base level, there are some administrative functions that need to happen at the state, that the state board fulfills for the community colleges. And again, the decisions that are made by the state board have all been developed collaboratively with the 17 colleges through the commissioner's leadership. And I think because the functions that we need from the state are most similar to the functions that K through 12 needs from the state, being under the board of K through with State Board of Education with K through 12 has worked very well for us. Our colleges were created mainly out of the K through 12 system. We have shared property tax revenues, local bonding authority, locally elected boards. OCCA, also as an organization, actually came out of the Oregon School Boards Association. They started us, and we're still members of the Oregon School Boards Association. So there's that very tight partnership. And it's really, I think, that function to provide the administrative role that's necessary from the state. I would say for the commissioner's role and CCWD's role, I think it's really the leadership that they provide to the community colleges. That's leadership that's designed in a way to enable that local work. It's really a support system and a support network that CAM provides that helps bring items to scale, that helps set the agenda, but is done in partnership and in a way that I think enhances the college's role locally.
I think CAM has one of the hardest roles. And part of it has to do with because basically she pulls us together. And we've got 17 boards, and we've got 17 presidents, and we're all collaborative, but no one's meek around this group. So how you bring us together and work things through and then take it to the board and work with what used to be joint boards, now with OEIB, as you work all that through, it's very different. On top of that, she has a workforce board she reports to that we're really glad about because we do workforce. But that also is a very different. So I think CAM's role of leadership of how you bring key issues and bring key people, it's never a mandatory thou shalt. It's really how do I invite you that this is better for you than what you had before, to do that day in and day out, and every so often take one of us aside and say, you may not get the picture. Will you listen more carefully? And she does that. That's a very important role because I think she takes her innovation and she brings it to scale. That's not easy to do on an always voluntary basis, and she makes it look easy, and we look good because of it. But it is voluntary, and it's because of the skill set that she brings to that. It is not an easy piece to do. She gets a lot of credit for keeping 17 of us moving things forward. Andrea gets a lot of credit because she keeps our boards and all the presidents together. But together, it's a powerful package. But the state board is really the final say. When you get to budget and when you get to administrative role, they're the final say, and somewhere you need someone that's the final say. But almost most of the time, we go there together, and we come up with a solution together. But I think there's some things you could not do by 17 with enabling that legislation that started us without having some group at some point On a few key issues, say yes or no, and that is needed.
Well, I'm going to propose that we wrap up, just being that we're so far over already. Any final questions or comments? I want to say thank you very much, very thoughtful.
Thank you.
Our final agenda, well, subcommittee discussion. I don't know if there's further discussion to be had. We'll discuss them along the way. And last on the agenda is other testimony.
We don't have any.
Don't have any signed up. So with that, I'm going to move to adjourn. Thank you, everyone.